Well, thank you for joining us for another episode of Marking the Times. This is Dr. Mark Hitchcock here in my office at Faith Bible Church in Edmond, Oklahoma. And next week is Thanksgiving, so let me go ahead at the outset here and wish all of you a happy Thanksgiving for next week. I hope you're able to get together at least with some of your family and give thanks to God for all of His blessings to us. We need to be people of great gratitude as believers in Jesus Christ. What I want to do today in Marking the Times is talk about kind of a piece of the prophetic puzzle that seems to be kind of out of place right now. And we often talk about how things are lining up and how the stage is being set, the way is being paved for many prophecies in the future to be fulfilled. But something's happened here recently that's kind of a piece of the puzzle that seems to be out of place. I want to talk about that because sometimes we don't talk about those things. We just talk about all the things that kind of fit in place. But when a piece seems to be out of place, I think we need to address that and think about that as well. And what I'm talking about is the recent peace agreement, or I guess you just call it more of a normalization of relations agreement that Israel has with Sudan. And we've talked about this whole kind of momentum for peace with Israel here in the last few months because, Egypt back in the late 70s became the first Arab nation to at least not be at war with Israel. Then Jordan followed in 1994. And then we had a 26-year dry spell. And United Arab Emirates and Bahrain signed these normalization of relation agreements with Israel earlier this year. And then just about a month ago, Sudan got engaged in this normalization of relations with Israel. And that was really a surprising one. In fact, many are saying there's more nations to come, that Kuwait may be next in line, Saudi Arabia, some of these other nations, which that would fit the prophetic puzzle. But Sudan right now is kind of a little bit of an outlier that doesn't fit in. And just a little bit about Sudan. Sudan has been a foe of Israel since its founding in 1948, since Israel's founding. It was the side, interestingly, Sudan was of a declaration against normalization with Israel back in 1967. The Arab League met there in the capital of Sudan called Khartoum, and these nations swore together no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. Sudan fought against Israel in the war for independence, or the war of really Israel's formation in 1948. They fought against Israel in the Six-Day War in 1967. They provided haven for Palestinian guerrillas. They gave asylum to Osama bin Laden back in the late 1990s. So they've been an inveterate enemy of Israel, really, and of the United States as well. But all of a sudden now we have this normalization of relations agreement between Sudan and the nation of Israel. And what's significant about that is Sudan is one of the nations mentioned in Ezekiel 38 as being part of the Gog coalition against Israel in the end times. We've talked about Ezekiel 38 and 39 several times here in our episodes of Marking the Times. And Ezekiel 38, as most of you know, predicts a coalition of nations led by Russia and Turkey and Iran that will descend upon Israel in the end times, in the last days. And Russia's a part of that, as I said, Turkey. Iran is mentioned under the name of Persia. Turkey is mentioned as Gomer and Meshech and Tubal and Togarmah. We also have Put that's mentioned that I believe is Libya. But then in verse 5 of Ezekiel 38, it says Persia, Ethiopia, and Put with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Well, Ethiopia there is just an English translation, but the word really, the Hebrew word is Cush. And the kingdom of Cush was the nation at that time that was south of Egypt, which is modern-day Sudan. So this is telling us that Sudan will be part of the nations that will invade Israel in the end times. So this treaty, this normalization agreement that Sudan has with Israel right now is kind of a piece of the puzzle that's not fitting. Bahrain and United Arab Emirates entering into these agreements with Israel, that fits because it says later on in Ezekiel 38 that Sheba and Dedan and these other nations, part of the Persian Gulf area, will be nations that will oppose the invasion of Israel by these other nations. If Saudi Arabia were to normalize with Israel and Kuwait and other nations, that would fit. But Sudan doesn't fit because we know when the end times arrive, they're going to actually be an enemy of Israel. So you say, well, okay, well, what do we make of that? Well, I think a few things. One is that nations act in their own national interest. They act in their own self-interest. And it's in the national interest and the self-interest of Sudan right now to be in this agreement with Israel, to be taken off of the state sponsors of terror by the United States so they can enjoy more economic prosperity. But we do know in the Middle East and that part of the world, things change quickly. There will be a lot of twists and turns as we head towards the ultimate fulfillment of prophecy in the end time. So while Sudan has entered into this agreement with Israel now, we know that ultimately they're going to turn against Israel. They're going to go back and join in with their old former allies again, and they will ultimately be against Israel. But I think what this agreement Sudan has made with Israel does show there, though, is there's an overall momentum towards peace with Israel. And that is consistent with Bible prophecy. But somewhere down the line, Sudan is going to get out of this agreement and they're going to join this coalition that's going to come against Israel in the end times. We'll keep watching these peace treaties with Israel and keep bringing you up to speed as more of these come to pass. Well, thank you again so much for joining us, and God bless you. And again, I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving with your family next week. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.